She sat in my office and looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, and she said, "Well, what happens if I don't believe in God?" I knew that this question had been tormenting my dear friend for the past 34 years. When we were teenagers, we went to the high school in Israel together, which was really one of the most formative experiences of my life. I learned so much, I made lifelong friends, and I fell in love with the land and the people of Israel. But something else happened that summer that had a profound impact on me as well. You see, when my girlfriend and I were in Israel together, her older brother was at summer camp, working at a camp in New England. He was my age, and we had gone all through religious school together and were confirmed together. And he was one of those golden boys. He was beautiful, smart, athletic, a natural-born leader. And he and his sister were so very close. He was scheduled to be president of the student council in the coming year, and she was going to be vice president of the student council. But all of that changed that summer. One dark night, he was out with friends, and there was a horrible car crash, and his life was abruptly and tragically ended. How could someone so alive, so beautiful, whose life had so much promise, be gone forever? I've never forgotten that day, and I've never stopped wrestling with those questions. My girlfriend and I have remained very close and celebrated many of life's moments together, but that experience is always the backdrop of our friendship. So that summer was 34 years ago. And at the end of this summer, I got an unexpected call from my friend. She was in town with her 5 beautiful children, and she wanted to come in and talk to me about her oldest children's upcoming B'nai Mitzvah. And so they came into my office, and she was surrounded by these children, and we started talking about Torah portions and dates, and that led to talk about mitzvah projects. And as I was talking to them about a mitzvah being between a person and God, that's when she stopped me. And that's when her eyes welled with tears. And she said, "But what happens if I don't believe in God?" She was asking, I knew, much more in that question. I understood the deep darkness of her soul that question came from, and the pain that was still raw and aching. I knew that her suffering had distanced her from God, and I knew that it had distanced me too. And I wondered how many other people there are, maybe even sitting here today, maybe not sitting here today, who feel the same way. Those who lost a husband, or a child, or a job, or maybe a wife who left for another man, or a child who's not speaking to you, or a cancer that's returned, or a parent who's losing her mind. We all sit here today, all of us, with our disappointments, our little pains, our quiet suffering. And we come to synagogue every year for our annual reckoning with God. God the King, God the author of life and death, God of earthquakes and God of hurricanes, God who tells Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. Our Mafzor, our High Holy Day prayer book, provides us with this ancient script, and we respectfully utter the words as we rise and sit and sing and speak. We make the assumption that everyone's comfortable with these words. But let's admit it. God is the elephant in the living room of our synagogue. Who are you? And why should I believe in you? And how can I believe in you when there's so much suffering? Are you there, God? It's me, Gail. For me, there's a huge disconnect between many of the words and images in our liturgy and my own personal beliefs. I know that I don't believe in a God in a throne with white hair and a beard, a kind of Santa Claus of the heavens who's making a list and checking it twice. But what do I believe? So a few weeks after my meeting with my friend, I had another meeting with a bar mitzvah family. And once again, I was talking about a mitzvah being between a person and God. And once again, I was stopped. But this time by the inquisitive bar mitzvah boy. But I have to tell you, the 12-year-old confessed, I'm an agnostic. Okay, I said to him, tell me what that means to you. It means I'm not really sure what I believe in. I guess I'm one too, I said to him. The bar mitzvah boy was in the right place. We are all in the right place to question. Many of you know the name Yisrael, our name, means one who wrestles with God. Just as our ancestor Jacob wrestled with the divine, and Job, and the ancient psalmist, so too do we grapple to find and know God. Rabbi Larry Kushner tells this story about the author proofs he received from his publisher for his book entitled, God Was in This Place, and I Did Not Know. That was the title of his book. So Federal Express took it upon itself to unceremoniously shorten the title from those 11 words to one, God. And so one day, a Federal Express package arrived at his home from his publisher, labeled God Proofs. After his kids signed for it, they called him at work to tell him that what he had been waiting for and working for his entire life had arrived via FedEx. It's finally here, Dad. God Proofs. Kushner, without missing a beat, replied, does it have a return address? Would that there was such a package or a return address to which we could write for more information. But it's more complicated than that, much. There's a passage from the book of Exodus which I've grown to love. And that passage reads, and Moses approached God where the fog was. Now this is a vision to which I can relate. Not God on a throne, but God in the fog. God at the border between the known and the unknowable. For living with God doesn't necessarily mean a life with clarity. I've recently been studying Professor and conservative Rabbi Bradley Artson's writings on something called process theology. Process theology asserts that the world and God are in continuous dynamic change of related interaction and becoming. That's a mouthful. What it means is that God continues to evolve in our world and become through our awareness of God and our work carrying out God's designs. In other words, God grows as we grow. He says that classical Judaism has mistakenly conveyed the notion that God is omnipotent, all-powerful, and omniscient, all-knowing. When we accept those ideas as truths, it leads to these intolerable consequences. If God is omnipotent, all-powerful, that means that everything can be attributed to God. Everything. my friend's brother's death, 9/11, the Holocaust, cancer, all of it is God's responsibility. This is what Artson calls a theological straitjacket. It's what leads to people feeling abandoned by God, or even worse, punished by God. Rather than understanding injury, decay, and death as a natural outcome of what it means to live in our dynamic world, it becomes God's fault. But what we don't know, what we haven't learned, is that this concept is actually not in the Torah. In fact, in Hebrew, there's not even a word for omnipotent. And the same problem exists for omniscience. If God is all-knowing, if God knows everything, then there's no possibility for human free will to exist. And as we read even in this morning's Torah portion, in the story of Adam and Eve, they were cast out of the Garden of Eden. Why? Because they chose to eat the forbidden fruit. Clearly, human free will is it's embedded in our tradition. But somehow, over the years, Judaism was layered and influenced by medieval philosophy, which left us in this untenable theological bind. Instead, process theology teaches about God as becoming rather than being. God as becoming rather than being. When Moses asked God's name in the desert, God responds, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I am what I am becoming. I am what I will be. And when we call God by the name Yud-He-Vav-He, the name we pronounce as Adonai, it's actually more like we're speaking to God as a verb. So what does that mean? What does that teach us? Perhaps it means that God continues to unfold in our universe through our consciousness of God's presence, our awareness of the invisible lines of connection between all of us and all of creation, that unity that we proclaim in the Shema. Yes, God is in the fog, but there are unexpected moments when the borders of ourselves melt away and we transcend time and space. Moments when we become aware that we are part of something much greater than any one of us. Fugitive seconds of recognition, glimpses of God revealed to us. We suddenly see in a different way for a moment of sacred coherence. Rabbi Kushner once asked a bunch of people in a room how many of them believed in God, and no one raised a hand. But because he's such a great teacher, he decided to ask the same question differently. And so he asked instead, how many of you have ever experienced God? And suddenly, in a room full of non-believers, every person raised their hand. This is the difference between witnessing God's reality and proving that God exists. This past year, I was privileged to catch one of those rare glimpses of God, and I want to tell you about it. We have a young lady in our congregation who's been given more than her share of challenges, cognitive and otherwise. And as her 13th birthday approached, her family wanted to celebrate her bat mitzvah. She hadn't attended Hebrew school, and she hadn't studied a Torah portion, but she attended Shabbat services religiously with her father. And so Cantor Haas worked lovingly with her family to help prepare a service just for her. And we knew it was going to be a little more improvisational and a little less structured than most of our services. Sophia was going to chant the blessings with friends and family, but then the friends and family were actually going to chant from the Torah for her. And so the first Aliyah came as planned, and Sophia stood with the friends next to the Torah and chanted the blessing with them. But then, instead of moving aside for the friend to chant Torah, Sophia planted herself in the center of the bima, and she began chanting. It sounded just like Torah, but it didn't come from the scroll in front of her. It came from her soul, from Sinai. And that's when every one of us who were privileged to be there knew that we had seen a glimmer of God. This morning's Torah portion, Bereshit, teaches us something else about God and about humanity. It teaches us that all of us were created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. That God planted a piece of the eternal inside each one of us. And it's this spark, this kol damama daka, this still small voice inside of each one of us that beckons us to do good, to be God's presence in this messy, often unfair world. There's a story that's told of a student who's distressed by the horror and evil of the world. And so he goes to his rabbi to complain and demands of the rabbi, "This world is terrible. How could God have created such a place? I could have done better myself." "Exactly," said the rabbi. "That's why you're here. Now get to work." Our awareness of God is what makes us feel like we have been sent. It's what summons us to do good in this world, to be better, to give more of ourselves, to do mitzvot, and then the act of doing the mitzvah is what connects us again to the divine. It's this spark of God which whispers inside of us and gives people courage. There's a gentleman in our congregation, Dr. Chad Perlin, who's a pediatric plastic surgeon. And last year, after the hurricane in Haiti, he immediately left his job, left his family, traveled to Haiti at great risk to repair children's lives. That was the kol damama daka, the still small voice. And it's that same spark that's what gets our Mazon crew, those who feed the homeless, every single month. It's what puts them to work. Even if they're tired, even if they have other commitments, they show up. And it's the same spark inside of each one of you that enables you to do the sacred work you do. It's what energizes you and helps you to repair our world. As the great Jewish philosopher Martin Buber said, God does not want to be believed in, debated, and defended by us, but simply to be realized through us. God does not want to be believed in, debated, and defended by us, but simply to be realized through us. When we feel ourselves to be part of something grand, something larger than ourselves, something divine and something holy, it can be a great source of courage and strength. This past spring, when my dad was diagnosed with cancer, my prayers went something like this. When he first felt pain in his back, I prayed that it wasn't something serious. When cancer was found, I prayed that it hadn't spread. When we learned it had spread, I prayed that it was the good kind of cancer, something that was curable. In the end, I prayed that he not suffer. I prayed for him to have courage and strength, and for me and my mom and my sister to have the same. I prayed that we wouldn't be too weary from all the schlepping and appointments and setbacks to give him our compassion and our love. You know, I never believed in a God who was going to change our reality. No. I prayed to feel God's comfort and God's closeness. I prayed to gain the strength and wisdom to know how to navigate our burdens. And I prayed to feel embraced by God's love. And you know what? Simply by uttering the words, my prayers were answered. Because in uttering the words, I was connected to that infinite source of strength and comfort and hope. And when my father passed away, I didn't feel that God had abandoned us. Oh no. I felt that God's presence was reflected in all of you, in our friends, in the meals you sent, the notes you wrote, the calls you made, the donations you gave, the minions you attended. Through all of you, God was manifest to us, through your love and through your actions. My heart aches when I think about my dad, especially during these holidays. And when I remember the tragedy of my dear friend's brother. There's no way to ever make sense of the loss of a young person, ever. The painful limits of our life here on earth. But when I see my friend surrounded by her 5 beautiful children, and how she's completely dedicated her life as a pediatrician to accident prevention and awareness, I'm struck by how she's been able to transform her grief into nourishing life and her brokenness into healing. In this, I see the God of my faith, the God who helps us to renew ourselves, to harvest hope, the God who enables us to transcend our finite boundaries and rise to be part of something infinite, something holy. In this Rosh Hashanah, this new year, may we all feel moments of transcendence and clarity. And may this opportunity for renewal help each of us to open our hearts, our minds, and our souls to the infinite possibility of God. In the words of E.E. Cummings, I thank you, God, for this most amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees, and a blue, true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes.